I can feel the crunch of the leaves and small twigs as they break under my feet as we walk a small path in the forest, just outside St. Anthony's. The path is narrow and covered in forest plants like moss and wild garlic. Clearly, it has not been used in a while. Thankfully, it's a full moon tonight. Its light shining through the branches of the ash trees onto the path so I can see where I was going. Just. I'm still not sure if I made the right choice, but I wanted to get along with Sam, considering he is the only person my age that I knew here. "I know you noticed," Sam said out of the blue. It takes me a moment to realize he was trying to start a conversation with me, but I was too busy trying to not trip on the roots of the ash trees that had broken the surface of the muddy ground. "Noticed what?" I ask him. He gives me a small laugh in response. "How strange my parents acted when I told you about the castle. How angry my mum got?" Oh, he's referring to the dinner we had a few hours ago. I remember thinking Aunt Lily's behavior was strange. "It was hard to miss," I comment, as the path starts leading us downhill. Sam was walking slightly ahead of me. Clearly, he was confident that he wouldn't trip on anything. I finally take my hands out of my jean pockets to better keep my balance on this muddy and unfamiliar path. This moment of silence allows me to hear what sounds like running water, and now I can smell burning wood. A campfire, maybe. "It's because she thinks I was trying to scare you." I look up from the ground I was trying to navigate to see the back of his dark silhouette ahead of me. "Were you?" I ask him in response. He stops walking, making me stop a few feet behind him. He turns around to look at me with a slight smirk on his face. "A little, but I could tell you were not. It's why I asked you to come with me," he tells me, and then turns around and keeps walking towards the sound of running water. I stay still for a few seconds longer, my aversion to the slippery path momentarily forgotten. He must have realized I wasn't following him because he stops again and turns to face me. "I thought you would like to meet some friends of mine. You'll like 'em. They don't believe in that superstitious shit either," he tells me. I slowly start walking down the slippery slope again, catching up to a still stationary Sam. "Do people here actually believe that stuff?" I ask as we start walking again. Sam's still slightly ahead of me. He doesn't answer my question. I looked down and noticed the ground was becoming more sandy than muddy, and the rotten leaves were becoming less frequent, the trees more spaced out, making me slightly more confident in walking. I look up again, now the path was more walkable for me, and noticed we have arrived at a riverside, which explains the sound of running water. The river itself wasn't very fast, but it was splashing around due to a strong current, making the noise I could hear in the woods. The water itself looks black even in the moonlight. The smell of a campfire was now a lot stronger. I followed the smell and looked to my left to notice a small fire with two shadowy figures huddled around it a few meters away. Sam was walking towards the pair, and I'd fallen behind again. I follow behind Sam, my feet slightly sinking into the sand and slowing me down. Sam lowers himself onto a fallen log. Sitting next to him was a boy around the same age, and dressed in the same style. Simple jeans and a black hoodie. The only major difference between the two was the other boy was a full head taller than Sam, even sitting down. As I stopped just outside this circle of friends, Sam looking up to me from the log he was sharing with the other boy. "Guys, this is my cousin Jason. Jason, this is Andy." He points at the tall boy, who gives me a casual wave in response. "And this is Sally." He gestured to a girl who was sitting on the dry sand close to the forest's edge. She was also wearing casual clothes, skinny jeans and a purple knitted jumper that was a little too big for her. Her hair was in a messy bob and was dyed a shade of blue. "He's staying here for the summer with me," Sam tells them. I decide to copy Sally and sit on the dry sand close to the fire with my legs crossed. I stare into the fire, getting lost in thoughts of home and my annoying parents. It takes me a moment to realize that Andy was talking to me. "So, has Sam told you anything about St. Anthony's yet?" Andy asks me, I look up at him, his face lit up by the orange glow of the fire. It's enough for me to see his blue eyes and blonde hair that was falling onto his face. He mentioned something about the castle. I reply, and Andy nods his head at me. Well, if you're going to be staying here this summer, you might as well know, Andy claims. What is so special about the castle? I ask Andy with a hint of annoyance in my voice. Did people think it was haunted or something? Andy lets out a small laugh as he nudges a stone that keeps the campfire contained with his white Converse. The original castle was built in 1346, just after King David II of Scotland was captured by the English at the Battle of Neville's Cross. The Lord of St. Anthony's built it to protect the town in case of another Scottish invasion, Andy explains to me. Apparently, a secret tunnel was built under the castle, as a way for people to escape the Scots if they came back and attacked the town. Andy continued. Obviously this was just a rumour, even then, but in 1746, just after the end of the last Jacobite rebellion, a small group of soldiers returning from Culloden Field stayed here at St. Anthony's. They apparently found the hidden entrance of the secret tunnel, Andy explains to me. The soldiers wanted to go down and investigate, but the passage was too narrow for a grown man. So they sent a local boy down with a drum, told him to walk down the tunnel while banging the drum, and they would follow above ground until they found the tunnel exit. Andy tells me as I look up at the sky while he talks. I could see the castle in the distance. It was dark and haunting in contrast to the clear starry night sky. I bring my gaze back down to the trio in front of me again. All of them seem to be lost in thought like I was a few seconds ago. I decide to start the conversation again. So what? They sent the boy down the tunnel. How is that scary? I ask the group, not believing that was the end of the story. Because he never came out again. I jump at the voice that spoke to my left. I turn to look at Sally, who had been silent until this point. I make eye contact with her and see she had this haunted look in her eyes. What do you mean? He just disappeared? I ask her. She looks into the flickering flames of the fire as she answers me. The soldiers on the surface followed the drumming. The drumming was leading them away from St. Anthony's. But the drumming just stopped. She explains to me. I sit there, looking at her with interest. Not only because of the story, but because of the way she told it. Like she had lived it herself. The rattle of the leaves blowing in the trees as a soft breeze disturbs them brings me back to myself. I look at Sam to see him looking at Sally. I notice Andy was looking at her too. The way you would look at somebody who had just lost a loved one. Andy's telling of the story made it clear that this all happened hundreds of years ago. So why did she seem so sad? And in my opinion, this story of a secret tunnel and a lost drummer boy sounded like just another local legend. Like that legend of the big black dog that haunts East Anglia. That doesn't sound like a very horrifying legend. Is that it? I ask Sam, not believing that that was the whole story. He turns to look at me, face illuminated by the fire that divided the two of us. He hesitates for a moment, casting a cautious look at Sally before looking back at me. In the 90s, 2 history students from London came to St. Anthony's. They had heard of the legend of the lost drummer boy and wanted to see if they could find the tunnel entrance. Sam explains to me, keeping his voice somber, like he is trying to be respectful. One night they went out to look for it and they just never came back. Sam finishes. This had to be made up, right? I look at Andy, who was still looking at Sally with clear sympathy. Sally still hadn't taken her eyes off the fire. I look back at Sam, shock clearly on my face. They both went missing. In the same night. I ask Sam in shock, and he just nods his head at me. I open my mouth to ask more questions, but a sound in the distance causes us all to pause. A few seconds pass and I was convinced that it was probably just a bird or something. But when I look at the others, they have their eyes locked on the forest. They gaze past the trees that the fire illuminates and beyond into the darkness. I begin to think that maybe they were just playing a prank on me, but when a shout of "Sam!" echoes through the ash trees from a distance away, I realise that that wasn't the case. Sam, Andy and Sally suddenly stand up, disturbing the dry sand beneath their feet, and accidentally kicking it at my still sitting form. All three of them have still to take their eyes off the forest, and as I brush the sand off my jeans, a glimmer of light catches my eye. I stand with the rest of the group and look through the trees to see what was going on. I knew we were in trouble the instant the light from a flashlight shined on Sam's face. "Run!" Sam whispered, and him, Sally and Andy instantly take off, following the river downstream and away from where the light was coming from through the trees. It takes me a second to start running after them, having no idea where I was going or where Andy was leading us as he ran ahead of the pack. I look back slightly to see the torchlight joined by other lights, and they were shining on our still burning campfire. "Hide! Hide!" I yelled to the group in front of me. If the people with the lights, who I am assuming are Sally, Andy and Sam's parents, turned left, they would see us running down the bank for sure. To my surprise, Andy must have heard me. He takes a sharp turn left, and into the forest we all follow. We crouch down amongst the foliage of trees, moss and ivy vines. We are all silent as we catch our breath. Running in the sand really takes it out of you. And we sit there. I'm suddenly hit with happiness. Why was I happy at running away from a group of adults? My aunt and uncle most likely included. Was it because I wasn't alone? But from the mischievous smiles that Andy and Sam were sending me, I would guess this was a good start. "Okay, if we are really quiet, we can get to the bridge and cross the old ruins," Andy explains to us. He clearly didn't plan on turning himself in yet. "The old ruins?" I ask. Did he mean the castle? "They are just some old ruins on the other side of the river. Nobody goes there." I nod my head as he explains this to me. Before we can get up and start to move though, Sally grabs onto my arm to stop me from getting up. I look over to her, and although it's dark and I can't see her facial expressions, I'm guessing there is something she doesn't like about Andy's plan. "Nobody goes there because that entire area is a bog. If we get caught in it, we could drown." "I'm not going," Sally states in defiance. "It's only the middle of the ruins which is dangerous," Andy says, defending his plan. "And besides, I'm not going back yet. The night's still young," he says with youthful arrogance. Sally is about to say something else when we notice that the voices and the flashlight beams are getting closer to our location. Andy turns to Sam and asks, "You in?" To which Sam gives a firm nod. He then turns to me. "Jason, you are coming?" He asks me. Sally is clearly not impressed by this idea, and I did not enjoy the idea of drowning in a bog. But this was the first time in my life that I felt included, having fun with people my own age. Should I go to the old ruins with Sam and Andy, or turn myself in with Sally?